At first glance, Texas looks endless. Flat highways, burning skies, towns that disappear as fast as they appear. But scattered across this vast landscape are places so sealed off, so controlled, that even time itself seems to slow down once you cross their gates. These are not just prisons. They are pressure chambers, designed not only to confine bodies, but to test the limits of the human mind. Behind layers of razor wire, steel doors, and silent corridors, Texas operates some of the most isolated and brutal prison units in the United States. Places where daylight becomes a memory, where silence is enforced, where men can spend decades locked inside concrete boxes no larger than a parking space, alone. This is not about rehabilitation. This is not about second chances. This is about control. In Texas, isolation is a weapon. At facilities like Polunsky Unit, home to the state's death row, isolation isn't a temporary measure, it's a way of life. Prisoners can spend 22 to 24 hours a day locked inside single-man cells. Meals are slid through slots. Human contact is reduced to orders barked through steel doors. For some inmates, the only voices they hear for years come from guards they never see face to face. No yard, no group programs, no normal conversation, just concrete, steel, and the sound of your own thoughts echoing back at you. Further east, units like Estelle Unit and Eastham Unit carry a legacy built on punishment-first philosophy. These prisons weren't designed for comfort. They were designed to dominate. Long corridors, narrow cells, and strict lockdown regimes create an environment where control is absolute and mistakes are paid for immediately. In these units, stepping out of line doesn't always mean losing privileges. It can mean losing sunlight, losing movement, losing contact with another human being. Solitary confinement in Texas is not rare. It is routine. Some inmates are placed in administrative segregation for months, others for years. Some never leave it at all. The reason can range from violence to suspected gang affiliation to being labeled too dangerous to mix with others, a label that once applied is nearly impossible to remove. Inside these isolation cells, the world shrinks fast. The lights never fully go out. The walls never change. The silence presses in. Former inmates have described talking to insects, pacing until their feet bled, or screaming just to hear another sound besides their own breathing. Guards, trained to limit interaction, become faceless shadows, keys jingling, boots passing, doors slamming shut. And then there are the rural units, prisons so remote that escape feels impossible not because of walls, but because there's nothing beyond them. Units like Allred Unit and Hughes Unit sit miles away from major cities, surrounded by empty land and silence. Even families struggle to reach them. Visits become rare. Phone calls become lifelines. Isolation here doesn't end at the cell door, it extends into geography. Texas correctional policy has long favored security over psychology, lockdown over dialogue, control over care. Mental health treatment exists on paper, but in many of these units, the environment itself actively worsens mental illness. Anxiety, paranoia, depression, and psychosis are not side effects. They are predictable outcomes. Yet the system continues. Every door that slams shut reinforces a message. You are alone. You are forgotten. You will adapt or break. And while Texas officials argue that these units keep staff and inmates safe, critics point to a darker reality. That prolonged isolation often creates the very violence it claims to prevent. Men released from segregation back into the general population carry years of bottled rage, fear, and psychological damage with them. Some never recover. This is the unseen side of Texas justice. Not courtrooms, not verdicts, but what happens after the sentence, when the cameras leave, the appeals fade, and the door closes behind you for the last time. Tonight, we're going inside these walls. Inside Texas' most isolated prison units. Inside cells where silence is enforced. Inside a system built to punish first and ask questions later. Because in Texas, freedom isn't just taken away. It's erased. Before we begin, tap like, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us uncover the darkest corners of the prison system. Now let's step inside. For most people, the word sentence has a beginning and an end. A number of years. A release date. Something to count down toward. In Texas' most isolated and brutal prison units, a sentence is something else entirely. It doesn't stop at the judge's gavel. It doesn't end with the prison gate closing behind you. In many cases, the real punishment begins after the paperwork is signed. Long before an inmate ever reaches a super isolated unit, the process of separation starts quietly, almost invisibly. It begins with classification. Inside the Texas Department of Criminal Justice System, every inmate is measured, assessed, and labeled, not just by crime, but by perceived threat, gang affiliation, behavioral history, psychological profile. Even rumors can follow a man from one unit to another. Once a designation like high risk, administrative segregation, or death row custody appears on a file, it becomes a shadow that never fully goes away. For some inmates, that label becomes a life sentence within a sentence. Transfers into extreme isolation units are rarely explained in detail. One day an inmate may be housed in general population, navigating the unspoken rules of prison survival, and the next, he's ordered to pack his belongings into a mesh bag. Shackles are applied, hands cuffed to a waist chain, ankles locked together. The message is clear. Whatever comes next, you won't be walking into it freely. Prisoners often describe this moment as the last time they feel human. The transport process itself is deliberately dehumanizing. Long hours inside steel cages on buses or vans. No windows. No conversation. No explanation. Guards don't answer questions. Silence becomes policy. Every mile traveled is another layer of separation from the world they knew, and sometimes from any hope of normal prison life. When the transport finally stops, the environment changes immediately. The air feels heavier. The buildings look older, harsher. The gates don't open quickly, they grind. Facilities like Polunsky Unit weren't designed to rehabilitate. They were designed to contain, to isolate, to dominate movement and communication. Here, inmates sentenced to death, or deemed too dangerous for any other housing, are placed into near-total isolation from day one. Cells are concrete boxes. No windows. No view of the outside world. A solid steel door with a narrow slot is the only connection to anything beyond the walls. Meals arrive through that slot. Handcuffs are applied through that slot. Even medical checks happen through that slot. Human interaction is reduced to procedure. For inmates entering these units, the psychological shift is immediate and brutal. Noise disappears, not because it's quiet, but because sound has nowhere to travel. Every cough echoes. Every movement feels amplified. Time stretches in unnatural ways. Minutes crawl. Hours blur. There is no settling in. In Texas isolation units, routine is weaponized. Lights turn on and off at fixed times, but never fully dim. Count happens relentlessly. Day and night lose meaning. Without regular social interaction or environmental change, the mind turns inward, often violently. Men begin to replay their crimes, their trials, their mistakes, over and over again. Others retreat entirely. Former inmates have described lying on their bunks for weeks, staring at the ceiling, speaking to no one. Some refuse meals just to feel a sense of control. Others lash out, flooding cells, banging doors, screaming, not out of anger, but desperation. Any reaction is better than none. Texas officials often justify this level of isolation as necessary. They argue these inmates are dangerous, unpredictable, uncontrollable. But critics point out a darker truth. Many men enter these units already mentally ill, and isolation accelerates their decline. Once placed in administrative segregation or death row housing, release from isolation is extremely rare. Reviews exist on paper, but decisions are slow, opaque, and almost always conservative. Risk avoidance outweighs rehabilitation every time. In places like Estelle Unit, isolation isn't reserved only for death row. Entire wings operate under near-lockdown conditions. Inmates may leave their cells only for showers, alone, or brief recreation inside cages barely larger than the cells themselves. No grass, no open sky, just chain link and concrete. Even movement becomes punishment. Every escort requires restraints. Every door opens and closes behind the inmate in sequence, ensuring no two prisoners ever cross paths. The system is designed to erase community, to prevent alliances, to eliminate shared experience. Because shared experience creates solidarity, and solidarity creates resistance. Over time, inmates begin to internalize the rules of isolation. They stop asking questions, stop making requests, Stop expecting responses. Survival becomes about compliance, not progress. And then there's the fear, constant and unspoken. Not fear of other inmates, but fear of permanence. Fear that this cell is not temporary. Fear that years will pass unnoticed. Fear that the outside world will forget them entirely. For inmates with life sentences or death sentences, that fear becomes certainty. Letters from family slow down. Phone calls become shorter. Visits, if allowed at all, happen behind thick glass, through phones that crackle and cut out. Loved ones age. Children grow up. Parents die. And the inmate remains exactly where he started, frozen in time. Texas' most isolated prison units do not merely confine people. They suspend them. Between life and death. Between punishment and disappearance. This is the foundation of the system. A system where isolation is not a last resort, but a core strategy. Where control is valued more than outcomes. Where silence is not a side effect, but the goal. And this is only the beginning. Because once an inmate adapts to isolation, once the mind bends instead of breaking, Texas introduces the next layer of punishment. Long-term segregation, permanent lockdown, and the slow erosion of identity itself. Chapter 2 will take us deeper into the mechanics of long-term isolation and how Texas keeps men locked away for years without ever calling it torture. In Texas, isolation is not an emergency measure. It is a system. Once an inmate crosses the invisible line into long-term isolation, there is no clear path back. No finish line. No countdown. What follows is a carefully engineered routine meant to do one thing above all else. Maintain absolute control over the individual. Physically, psychologically, and socially. This is administrative segregation. And in Texas, it can last a lifetime. Unlike disciplinary confinement, which has a defined end date, administrative segregation is open-ended. Inmates are placed there not for what they did, but for who the system believes they might be. A suspected gang affiliation, a history of violence, an alleged threat to staff seemingly buried deep inside a file that the inmate may never see. Once labeled, the rules change instantly. Cells in long-term segregation units are typically no more than 6 by 9 feet. Concrete walls, a steel bunk, a combined sink and toilet. No window to the outside world. The door, thick steel, seals shut with a sound inmates never forget. It's not a slam. It's a lock. Final and deliberate. Every aspect of daily life is regulated. Wake up is forced, not natural. Lights flick on at fixed hours. Count happens multiple times a day, with guards peering through narrow windows or slots, ensuring the body inside hasn't disappeared. Meals arrive cold, slid through a tray slot without eye contact. Breakfast, lunch, dinner, identical patterns, different times. Conversation is discouraged, sometimes punished. In some Texas units, inmates are written up for attempting to communicate with others through doors or vents. Even shouting down the tier can lead to further restrictions. Silence isn't just expected, it's enforced. Recreation, if granted, is not relief. It's isolation in another form. Instead of open yards, inmates are escorted, shackled, to individual recreation cages. Concrete floors, chain link fencing overhead. No equipment, no grass, no real sky. Just a square of light and air that feels more like an experiment than exercise. One inmate, one cage, 1 hour, if that. Showers are similar. Scheduled, brief, conducted alone. Even basic hygiene becomes a controlled privilege rather than a human necessity. And always, restraints. Any movement outside the cell requires handcuffs, waist chains, and leg irons. Inmates learn to walk with short steps, guided by guards who never walk beside them, only behind or ahead. Control is physical, visible, and constant. Facilities like Estelle Unit operate entire wings under these conditions. Rows of segregation cells stretch down dim corridors, each one holding a man whose life has been reduced to compliance and waiting. The architecture itself reinforces the message: you are not meant to stay sane here. You are meant to stay contained. Over weeks and months, the effects of isolation begin to surface. Sleep becomes irregular. Some inmates sleep all day to escape the monotony. Others can't sleep at all, haunted by racing thoughts and endless replayed memories. Anxiety spikes. Paranoia grows. Harmless noises begin to feel threatening. Silence becomes unbearable. For inmates with pre-existing mental illness, segregation accelerates collapse. Texas policy technically prohibits placing severely mentally ill inmates in long-term isolation, but enforcement is inconsistent at best. Diagnoses are often downgraded. Symptoms are reframed as behavioral issues, and the solution is rarely treatment. It's more isolation. Mental health checks, when they occur, are often conducted through the cell door. No privacy, no meaningful conversation. A clipboard, a few questions, a box checked, and the door stays closed. Over time, inmates adapt, but not in healthy ways. Some detach completely, entering a state of emotional numbness. Others develop rituals just to mark the passage of time, counting cracks in the wall, pacing exact steps from door to bunk, repeating the same phrases aloud every day. The mind creates structure when the environment offers none. And then there's rage. Anger builds quietly in isolation. There is no outlet, no physical release, no social buffer. It simmers beneath the surface until it explodes, often in ways that only worsen conditions. Flooded cells, self-harm, assaults on staff during escorts. Each incident reinforces the system's belief that the inmate is too dangerous to be around others. A self-fulfilling cycle. At Polunsky Unit, this cycle reaches its most extreme form. Death row inmates live under conditions that mirror permanent administrative segregation. Single-man cells, minimal out-of-cell time, almost no physical contact with another human being for years, sometimes decades. Even executions do not interrupt the routine. Cells are cleaned, doors close. The tier returns to silence. For those not on death row, segregation reviews are supposed to provide hope. Periodic evaluations where officials assess whether an inmate can safely return to general population. In practice, these reviews are often brief, opaque, and conservative. One disciplinary write-up can reset the clock. One alleged association can keep a man locked down indefinitely. There is no incentive for risk-taking. From the system's perspective, keeping someone isolated is safer than reintegrating them. No group housing, no shared movement, no unpredictability. The human cost is irrelevant compared to institutional stability. And so years pass. Inmates enter segregation in their 20s and emerge, if they emerge at all, in their 40s or 50s. Many are released directly from isolation to the outside world, carrying the psychological scars of prolonged sensory deprivation into free society. Others never leave. They die in their cells. They age out. They disappear from memory. Texas isolation units are not chaotic. They are orderly, efficient, predictable, and that is what makes them so dangerous. There is no visible crisis, just a slow, quiet erosion of the people inside. This chapter of punishment doesn't rely on violence. It relies on time, on repetition, on silence, on the understanding that no one is watching closely enough to stop it. And as we move deeper into this system, one truth becomes unavoidable. Long-term isolation doesn't control behavior, it reshapes it. In Chapter 3, we'll examine how this environment changes inmates permanently, how isolation rewires the brain, fuels long-term damage, and creates men the system claims it needs to protect itself from. Isolation does not arrive all at once. It settles in slowly, quietly, until the damage feels normal. By the time an inmate has spent months inside long-term segregation in Texas, the mind has already begun to change. Not temporarily, not emotionally, structurally, neurologically. The brain, deprived of stimulation, routine social contact, and meaningful sensory input, begins to rewire itself just to survive. And survival, inside isolation, looks nothing like health. Texas officials often describe administrative segregation as restrictive housing, a neutral phrase, clinical, but for the men inside, it is a psychological experiment without consent, one that runs day after day, year after year, with no clear endpoint. At first, the changes are subtle. Inmates lose track of time. Days blur together. Without natural light or varied routine, the circadian rhythm collapses. Sleep becomes fragmented. Some inmates sleep 14 hours a day. Others pace their cells all night, unable to shut their minds off. Dreams become vivid. Nightmares bleed into waking hours. Then comes sensory distortion. In silence, the brain invents sound. In stillness, it creates movement. Inmates report hearing voices calling their names, footsteps that aren't there, doors opening that never do. Peripheral vision plays tricks, shadows stretch, walls breathe, light flickers even when it doesn't. The mind is starving, and it starts feeding on itself. In facilities like Estelle Unit, where segregation wings operate continuously, these symptoms are common knowledge among staff. Yet they are rarely treated as warning signs. Instead, they are logged as behavioral issues. Talking to oneself, yelling, noncompliance. Each symptom becomes justification for more isolation. An inmate who begins hallucinating may be written up for disturbance. An inmate who self-harms may be placed on suicide watch, inside another isolated cell. An inmate who breaks under pressure becomes proof that the pressure was necessary. It is a closed loop. Over time, isolation strips away emotional regulation. Inmates report feeling extreme anger one moment and complete emptiness the next. Empathy dulls. Fear intensifies. Small frustrations trigger disproportionate reactions because there is no social environment to recalibrate behavior. There are no normal human interactions to soften responses. No casual conversation. No shared laughter. No conflict resolution. Only commands. Compliance. Consequences. One former segregated inmate described the sensation as becoming smaller. Not physically, but mentally. Thoughts narrow. Goals shrink. The future stops existing beyond the next meal tray. Life becomes about managing minutes instead of building days. This psychological contraction is one of isolation's most devastating effects. For inmates serving life sentences or awaiting execution at Polunsky Unit, the damage is often irreversible. Decades spent in near-total isolation create men who struggle to hold eye contact, engage in conversation, or tolerate noise. Some develop panic attacks when exposed to open spaces. Others experience overwhelming anxiety when around other people, the very thing isolation was supposed to protect against. And yet, Texas frequently releases inmates directly from segregation into society. No transition, no therapy, no gradual reintroduction. One day, a man lives alone in a concrete box. The next, he's standing on a sidewalk with a bus ticket and no coping mechanisms for crowds, choices, or freedom. The consequences ripple outward into families, communities, and public safety. Isolation doesn't end at the prison gate. Inside the units, self-harm becomes both a symptom and a language. When inmates have no voice, the body becomes the message. Cutting, headbanging, starvation, suicide attempts. These acts are not always about dying. Often they are about being seen. But visibility is dangerous. Self-harm can lead to further restrictions. Property removal, strip cells, constant lighting, even less human contact. The environment tightens its grip, convinced it is responding to risk, while actively amplifying it. Mental health professionals exist within the Texas prison system, but their reach is limited by policy. Therapy sessions are rare. Medication is often the primary response. Sedation replaces conversation. Compliance replaces healing. And still, the isolation continues. Years inside segregation create what psychologists describe as institutional dependency. Inmates lose the ability to make decisions. They wait for orders. They hesitate when given choices. Freedom becomes terrifying because autonomy has been trained out of them. This is not accidental. Isolation creates predictability. Predictable inmates are easier to manage. They don't organize. They don't resist effectively. They don't form alliances. They exist in a narrow psychological lane where compliance is the safest option. But predictability comes at a cost. The longer a man remains isolated, the harder it becomes to ever place him among others. Social skills atrophy. Trust disappears. Conflict feels existential. The system then points to this damage as evidence that the inmate must remain isolated. Another loop. Another justification. Another year behind the door. Critics argue that prolonged isolation in Texas meets international definitions of psychological torture. United Nations experts have stated that more than 15 days of solitary confinement can cause lasting harm. In Texas, men endure it for 15 years, sometimes more. And yet, the practice persists. Because isolation doesn't leave visible bruises. Because the suffering is quiet. Because it happens behind walls no one sees. What emerges from these units are not rehabilitated individuals. They are survivors of an environment that prioritizes control over recovery, silence over solutions. And the most unsettling truth of all, many of these inmates entered segregation as dangerous men. They leave it broken once. In Chapter 4, we'll follow what happens when isolation reaches its most extreme form: permanent lockdown, zero meaningful contact, and the point where the system no longer pretends there is a way back. There is a point inside Texas prison system where isolation stops being a condition and becomes a destination. This is permanent lockdown, not a disciplinary phase, not a temporary measure, but a status, one that quietly removes any expectation of return. For inmates assigned to permanent lockdown conditions, the system no longer speaks in terms of progress or improvement. The language changes. Risk management replaces rehabilitation. Containment replaces correction. The goal is no longer to change behavior. It is to freeze it in place. And once an inmate enters this level of isolation, there is almost no way out. Permanent lockdown is most visible inside death row housing at Polunsky Unit, but it also exists in extreme administrative segregation wings across Texas. These are the inmates labeled never compatible, men the system has decided can never safely exist around others. Not today, not tomorrow, not ever. Cells become worlds. 23 to 24 hours a day are spent inside the same concrete box. Out-of-cell time, if granted, is minimal and alone. No group recreation, no shared air, no casual human presence. Even the routines meant to break monotony in other segregation units disappear here. In permanent lockdown, monotony is the point. The physical environment reinforces this reality. Steel doors remain closed nearly all day. Food slots open and close without words. Escorts happen silently, with multiple officers, full restraints, and strict choreography. Every movement is anticipated, every step controlled. There is no room for unpredictability. For many inmates, the most crushing part is not the confinement. It's the knowledge that nothing they do will change it. Good behavior does not lead to privileges. Compliance does not lead to reviews with real outcomes. The future collapses into a flat, endless present. Hope becomes dangerous, because hope implies change. And change is not part of permanent lockdown. Inside these units, even time itself becomes distorted. Without milestones, no classes completed, no programs advanced, no transitions between housing levels. Years slip by unnoticed. Inmates mark time through executions, staff retirements, or the slow decay of their own bodies. Men enter permanent lockdown in their 20s and age into their 60s without ever touching another human being freely. The psychological effects deepen. Unlike earlier stages of isolation, where inmates may still resist internally, permanent lockdown breeds resignation. Emotional flattening. Learn helplessness. The mind stops fighting because fighting has proven useless. Some inmates stop speaking altogether. Others speak only to themselves. Mental health deterioration in permanent lockdown is not an anomaly. It is expected. Depression becomes chronic. Anxiety becomes constant. Hallucinations intensify. Memory fades. Inmates forget conversations, dates, even their own voices. But treatment remains minimal. Mental health rounds are conducted through doors. Conversations are shouted through steel. Privacy does not exist. Trust cannot form. Therapy becomes a procedural checkbox rather than a human exchange. Medication increases. Sedation becomes management. In some Texas units, inmates in permanent lockdown are denied meaningful property. Books are limited. Personal items are removed for security reasons. Radios are sometimes prohibited. The environment becomes stripped down to bare survival. This sensory deprivation compounds the damage. Without external input, the brain retreats inward. Thoughts loop endlessly. Past trauma resurfaces. Regret becomes constant. For death row inmates, the looming presence of execution adds another layer. A countdown that exists without a date. Every knock on the door could be the one. At Estelle Unit, permanent segregation wings operate with similar rigidity. These inmates may not be sentenced to death, but their daily lives mirror death row conditions. The difference is that their confinement has no public visibility. No execution date, no media attention, just quiet disappearance. Family connections wither under permanent lockdown. Visits, if allowed, are non-contact. Thick glass, phones with static, conversations monitored and cut short. Some families stop coming. Others can't afford the travel. Over time, relationships erode not from lack of love, but from exhaustion. Isolation doesn't just punish the inmate. It punishes everyone connected to him. For staff, permanent lockdown creates a different kind of environment. Guards interact with inmates as threats rather than people. Repetition dulls empathy. Procedure replaces judgment. Officers are trained not to engage, not to converse, not to humanize, because humanization complicates control. This emotional distance protects the institution, but it damages the individuals inside it. Incidents in permanent lockdown are rare, but when they occur, they are extreme. Self-harm escalates. Suicide attempts increase. Inmates swallow objects, mutilate themselves, or provoke violent responses simply to feel something, anything, that breaks the monotony. Each incident reinforces the system's belief that these men must remain isolated. Again, the loop closes. Texas policy frames permanent lockdown as a necessity, a last resort for the most dangerous individuals. But critics argue that the system creates the conditions it claims to manage. Years of isolation produce instability. Instability justifies continued isolation. By the time an inmate is deemed too dangerous to release from permanent lockdown, the damage has already been done. And perhaps the most unsettling reality? Some of these inmates will never leave prison, but others will. Texas has released inmates directly from permanent segregation to the outside world. No transitional housing. No gradual resocialization. No mental health bridge. A man goes from near total isolation to total freedom overnight. The consequences are predictable and devastating. Permanent lockdown does not end violence. It delays it. It displaces it. It exports it. This is the final stage of isolation inside Texas prisons, where the system no longer pretends there is a path forward, where containment becomes the only objective, where silence is complete. And yet, beyond these doors, Texas continues to expand its prison infrastructure, defend its policies, and dismiss criticism as necessary toughness. In Chapter 5, we'll examine the long-term consequences. What happens to inmates who survive this system? What happens to the communities they return to? And why isolation may be creating the very dangers it claims to prevent. For years, sometimes decades, Texas' most isolated inmates are told, directly or indirectly, that they are too dangerous to exist around others, too unstable, too unpredictable, too broken to trust. And then one day, the door opens. No countdown, no gradual adjustment, no warning. A man who has lived in near total isolation steps out of a concrete box and is handed civilian clothes, a small stack of paperwork, and a bus ticket. The same system that insisted he could not safely share space with other prisoners now releases him into the open world, crowded, loud, fast, and unforgiving. This is the moment Texas rarely talks about, because isolation doesn't end when confinement does. It follows. For inmates released directly from long-term segregation or permanent lockdown, freedom is not relief, it is shock. The senses are overwhelmed almost instantly. Traffic noise feels violent. Open spaces trigger panic. Eye contact feels threatening. Choices, once non-existent, become paralyzing. Which direction do you walk? Who do you trust? How do you speak to strangers? Men conditioned to silence suddenly find themselves expected to function in a society built on interaction. Many can't. Years of isolation strip away the basic skills required for normal life. Conversation feels unnatural. Emotional regulation is fragile. Minor frustrations trigger outsized reactions. Anxiety manifests physically, shaking hands, racing heart, shallow breathing. Some former inmates describe feeling safer in small rooms than in open spaces because walls became protection rather than confinement. This is the hidden cost of isolation. Texas officials often frame release as a success story, proof that the system works. But for men exiting isolation, release is closer to abandonment. Mental health support is minimal. Transitional housing is limited. Supervision focuses on compliance, not recovery. And the clock starts ticking immediately. Former inmates must report to parole offices, find housing, secure employment, navigate social services, all while carrying the psychological damage of prolonged sensory deprivation. Any misstep, a missed appointment, a misunderstood instruction, an emotional outburst can lead to violation and reincarceration. Back to confinement. Back to isolation. Recidivism is not accidental here, it's structural. Some men never even make it that far. They self-isolate on the outside, retreating into small rooms, avoiding people, limiting movement. Isolation becomes familiar, safe, predictable. The world beyond feels hostile by comparison. Others spiral. Substance abuse becomes a coping mechanism. Drugs and alcohol numb the anxiety isolation created. For parole officers, this looks like irresponsibility. For the former inmate, it's survival. Communities feel the impact as well. Texas isolation units were designed to remove danger from society, but the men released from them often return more damaged than when they entered. Untreated trauma, suppressed rage, and social dysfunction don't disappear at the gate. They surface in families, neighborhoods, and public spaces. This is where the narrative fractures. If isolation was meant to protect society, why does it produce individuals less capable of living within it? The answer lies in the design. Isolation is excellent at controlling behavior inside prison walls. It is terrible at preparing human beings for life beyond them. The skills required to survive isolation, emotional shutdown, hypervigilance, distrust, are the exact opposite of what functional society demands. Inside, these traits are adaptive. Outside, they are liabilities. And for those who never leave prison, the ones who die in isolation, the cost is quieter but just as devastating. Years of human potential erased without acknowledgement. Lives reduced to case numbers. Deaths recorded as administrative outcomes rather than moral failures. At facilities like Polunsky Unit, executions draw attention, but the decades of isolation that precede them rarely do. The punishment is not just death. It is the slow dismantling of the self long before the final day arrives. At units like Estelle Unit, segregation wings quietly cycle men in and out of extreme isolation with little public oversight. These inmates don't make headlines. They don't have execution dates. They simply vanish into the system, and sometimes reappear on the outside, unrecognizable. Texas maintains that isolation is necessary, that some men cannot be managed any other way, that safety requires sacrifice. But the evidence suggests a harder truth. Prolonged isolation does not eliminate danger, it transforms it. It turns impulsive men into anxious ones, angry men into unpredictable ones, broken men into invisible ones. And when the doors finally open, Texas expects society to absorb the consequences without question. This is the final outcome of extreme isolation. Not order, not safety, but displacement. Harm pushed forward in time. Damage deferred rather than addressed. The system doesn't end violence. It stores it. In the final chapter, we'll confront the question Texas avoids, whether isolation is truly about safety, or whether it has become a punishment so normalized that its human cost no longer registers at all. When the doors close inside Texas' most isolated prison units, the sound doesn't echo for long. It doesn't need to. What follows is a silence so complete that it reshapes the people trapped inside it, and slowly, quietly, reshapes the world outside as well. Throughout this documentary, we've gone inside units designed to disappear men. Places where isolation is not a temporary response, but a permanent condition. Where time replaces violence. Where silence becomes punishment. Where control is valued more than outcome. Facilities like Polunsky Unit stand as symbols of this philosophy, not just because of executions, but because of the decades of isolation that precede them. Years spent alone in concrete cells. Years without touch. Years without meaningful human connection. A slow dismantling of identity long before the state ever claims a life. Texas calls this safety. But safety for whom? Inside these units, order is maintained through removal. Remove contact, remove choice, remove hope. On paper, it works. There are fewer fights, fewer incidents, fewer variables to manage. The system appears calm. Yet beneath that calm is damage that does not stay contained. Men leave isolation changed, neurologically, emotionally, socially. Some are released directly into society carrying trauma that was never treated. Others never leave at all, aging and dying inside cells that reduce their lives to routine and compliance. The public rarely sees this side of justice. We see courtrooms. We see verdicts. We see sentences read aloud. We don't see the years afterward, the endless days where nothing happens, and that nothing becomes the punishment itself. Isolation has become normalized in Texas, framed as necessity, defended as toughness, justified by fear. And because the suffering is quiet, it's easy to ignore. There are no riots to broadcast, no screams for cameras to capture, just men sitting alone, hour after hour, year after year, disappearing in plain sight. But silence does not mean absence. It means distance. Distance between the public and the consequences. Distance between policy and humanity. Distance between what justice claims to be and what it actually becomes behind closed doors. This isn't about excusing crimes. It isn't about denying harm done to victims. It's about asking whether a system built on extreme isolation truly protects society, or whether it simply postpones harm, reshapes it, and hands it back to the world later, damaged and unresolved. Because every prison reflects the values of the society that built it. And Texas has built places where punishment doesn't just take freedom, it erases people. The question isn't whether these units are legal. The question is whether they are humane, whether they are effective, and whether silence should ever be considered justice. Thanks for watching. Like, share, and subscribe. And stay informed, stay critical, and keep asking the questions others avoid.